Yeah, I begin? Okay, inshallah. All right, let's begin then. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna ilman wa amalan ya arhamar rahimin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are continuing with the Arba'in Nawawi, the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi rahimahullah. So previously we've discussed what is a hadith, and we discussed words that are synonymous or related to hadith. So we discussed sunnah, hadith and sunnah, the books of sunnah, and we looked at some of the differences between them, and then we moved on to look at the development of hadith. Right, this is called tadween in Arabic. Right, so we looked at the development of hadith, how hadith went from an oral tradition to it being committed to writing, and we divided this into a number of categories. So we actually looked into this, I think, in slightly more detail than it is perhaps looked at. We looked at writing in the pre-Islamic period, and then we looked at writing in the Meccan period, writing in the Medinan period. We looked at how Islam had a huge and tremendous and unprecedented role in contributing to literacy amongst Arabs and in Arabia in general. Just so that we can wrap up, inshallah, I hope to wrap up this discussion in today's session. We have a slide in front of us that then summarizes, if you like, rather neatly a trajectory of the types of writing that had taken place up to the Sahih movement, up to Sahih al-Bukhari. So one of the questions I think I asked you or that I raised is, I mean, we all know Sahih al-Bukhari. We've all heard of Sahih al-Bukhari, and Imam Bukhari rahimahullah was he was a 3rd century scholar. So the question then is, what happened 2 centuries, 3 centuries? It's the idea of trying to gap that bridge between the Prophet ﷺ, the companions, and Imam Bukhari rahimahullah. So here what you have is, there are broad strokes, but broadly speaking, anyone who studies literature, hadith, and its development can see that this is, broadly speaking, the method in which the hadith came about and we got to Sahih al-Bukhari. Also, what you'll notice is that if you study these properly, you'll see that this trajectory is not too different to how the other sciences developed. In that, so we'll quickly go through these. So I discussed these last lesson and the lesson before as well. So the Sahifa genre is what we call them, the Sahifa genre. So these were not meant to be for public consumption. These were works that were written as memory aids, if you like, or they were royal edicts that were written in a more formal sense. So you can imagine if you're a government and if the Khalif, for example, wrote an important announcement to his governors, that would be written down on expensive material. You can understand this. So these are the Sahifa genres, and we went through a number of them. If you remember, we went through the Sahifa Sadiqa, the Sahifa of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. This is a companion regarding whom Abu Huraira radiallahu ta'ala anhu said that I don't know of an individual who narrates more hadith than me, except perhaps for Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. And then he mentions why as well. He says that's because he used to write and I did not used to write, so I used to rely on my memory. So this was his impression, even though what we have now retrospectively, looking at the figures, if you remember, we went through these figures previously, we went through these. So this is a trajectory that we have, or this is a calculation of the most prolific transmitters amongst the companions. So you have Abu Hurairah anhu, you have Ibn Umar, Anas bin Malik, Aisha ibn Abbas. These are all famous companions. They're all closely related to the Prophet ﷺ. We notice that these are all junior companions during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, once he passes away, they're under 20 more or less. All of them are under 20. And so we have the total number of narrations over here. And what's interesting is that Abu Huraira is still the most prolific transmitter. But nonetheless, we have narrations, as I mentioned, of companions who wrote these, if you like, these memory aids down. And these were then, if you like, absorbed into subsequent texts that focused on narrating hadiths, right, or collecting them. So this is the phase one that I was mentioning. The second one, this is where it starts to become more formal. I've translated these as legal transcripts. This is largely because the musannaf genre tends to follow the legal, the arrangement of the legal genre, in that if you pick up any legal text, if you pick up a fiqh book, you'll realize that it begins with Kitab al-Tahara, then Kitab al-Salah, then Kitab al-Sawm, al-Zakat and Hajj. It follows that legal arrangement. What's unique about these musannafat is that they pay a huge amount of attention to what we would call local practice, or what you would call the you can call them Sharia councils if you like. You can call them Darul Ifta or Darul Fiqh of the various cities. So we call this Misr, or Ansar is the plural for it. And what we have is during the period of, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ up to, let's say, until the Umayyad period and so on, and further on, especially in the time of the companions, you had the Prophet ﷺ sending to each province that would be that would convert to Islam, or that would be conquered. He would send along with a governor, he would send a teacher, and he would send a qadi. And so what you have then in the legal transcripts are the fatwa that were given by the various muftis, if you like, or state appointed muftis in various cities. So you have, for example, in Yemen, you have Abu Musa Ash'ari, and you have Mu'adh ibn Jabal, right? And then in Medina, there's a number of individuals in Medina, but we'll go to Makkah. You have Ibn Abbas, who's predominantly considered the founder of the Meccan school. And then, if you like, you can go to Basra, and in Basra you will find Anas bin Malik, and you find Imran bin Hussein, radiallahu ta'ala anhuma. And then you would go to, for example, Kufa, and in Kufa you would find Ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu ta'ala an, who was sent by Umar ibn al-Khattab as a teacher. And there you would find also Mughira ibn Shu'bah, who was a governor for some time. And then you have Sa'd ibn Waqqas, and you have these major companions who are giving fatwa. Essentially, they're giving fatwa, and not only are they giving fatwa, they are training other their students whom are the tabi'een, and so they are then giving fatwa, and they are what we call scaffolding law, right? They are using the precedents of their teachers, and they are building on the legal mass, if you like, of fatwa that were given. So these musannafat are very important. It's a very important genre of literature, because again, if you're wondering where was fiqh prior to Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, where was fiqh prior to Imam Malik, right? Where was fiqh prior to Imam al-Shafi'i? Where was fiqh prior to Imam Ahmad? You'll find that gap is bridged through the musannaf literature. You will see, for example, that Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah primarily is relying on the fiqh of the Kufan elders, right? The fuqaha before him. Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman was a teacher, and thereafter you had his teacher Ibrahim al-Naq'i, and his teacher was Alqamah, and then his teacher was Ibn Mas'ud, right? So you find, for example, with Imam Malik rahimahullah, he also inherits a large mass. You can call it the Medinan precedent, if you like, or fatwa of the people of Medina. And studies have been made, for example, through the Mudawwana and through the Muwatta of Imam Malik rahimahullah. And we find that it is safe to say, with confidence, statistically, through comparative studies, that Imam Malik rahimahullah does not depart from the Medinan school, if you want to call it a school, or fatwa from people from Medina. He doesn't depart from this. So this is an important text or an important genre. What's unique about this genre then is that it contains prophetic and non-prophetic statements, right? Fatwa not just of the Prophet ﷺ, but also of non-prophetic sources. So if you look, for example, at the Muwatta, you'll find that the Muwatta has just as many non-prophetic fatwa and statements as it does prophetic ones, if not more. There are more non-prophetic statements than there are prophetic ones. It's safe to say that this is the case with the other Musannaf genres as well. This then leads me to the third phase, and this phase then, or if you like, is the Mu'jam Musnad one. The Mu'jam basically is a dictionary in Arabic. The Mu'jam is called a dictionary, or we call them the encyclopedias, and these are huge tomes, huge tomes. So for example, if you look at the Musnad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, who is the teacher of Imam Bukhari, you're looking at about 50 volumes, right? 50 volumes, 60 volumes. Baqi ibn Makhlid, this one is no longer available to us, but again, it's considered a large text, one of the largest texts that was known at the time. So these texts, again, what's unique about these is that they focus on prophetic only, not prophetic and unprophetic, prophetic only, and the arrangements of these texts are in alphabetical order. So you start with Alif, you start with Ba, then Ta, then Tha, looking at companions, and there's no particular order in which they are mentioned. So for example, a typical Musnad actually wouldn't begin with just Alif, Ba, Ta, they actually begin with the Ashara Mubashara, the 10 companions who were given the glad tidings of Jannah. And from the 10, they start off with the 4 Khulafa. So typically speaking, the first Musnad you'd find is the Musnad of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala an. And in no particular order, just any hadith that you have from Abu Bakr, you just add it there. But you can imagine that works like this then are specialist texts. They're not accessible for the average person, for 2 reasons. Number one, because there's no particular order in them, so you're just reading hadiths that pertain to Abu Bakr, that's it. And the other thing is that the isnads require sifting, because this period, the period 2 and period 3 that I have over here, is we can broadly call it the chronicler period. And the job of the chronicler is to chronicle anything that he finds under the sun, whether it's correct or incorrect. And so then we leave then this brings us to the phase 4, which is the one that we are aware of, the Sihah Sitta. The 6 books primarily come from the 3rd, 4th century, mainly the 3rd century. And if you look, for example, at Sahih Muslim, at the beginning of Sahih Muslim, there's a very nice foreword written by Imam Muslim himself, and in it he mentions why he began writing this book. So he says that one of his students was complaining about how these works, the Musannaf and Mu'jam works, are not easily accessible. So he's asking him to prepare a book in which there are only Sahih Hadiths, or Hadiths that he can rely on, that someone does not need to have the expertise to sift through the Hadith, through the Isnad, and then say, okay, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. If you could prepare a volume that condenses pretty much the content that is found in these works, and ensuring that it's Sahih only, right? Ensuring that one doesn't need to kind of sift through 50 volumes and it's just there prepared for them like that. So this is where we come to the turn of what we call now the critical period, right? So people first, broadly speaking, as I keep mentioning, that whether it's fiqh, whether it's history, whether it's seerah, whether the sciences that we know of them now have pretty much followed this pattern, where you've had someone like Tabari come along in tafsir, or you've got Ibn Ishaq from the seerah scholars, whose primary role is to chronicle, is to gather as many things as they can find. Tabari in his Tarikh is a good example, right? So then what happens is the generations that come thereafter then now talk about the critical mass, now think about sifting out what is credible from the not so credible, right? They talk about separating the wheat from the chaff. Anyway, so this I think is the discussion that I wanted to have regarding this. So here is a good example of the Sahifa genre. So the Mu'jam, for example, the Musnad, let's say we talked about, what are some of the Sahif we talked about? We talked about the Sahifa of Hammam ibn Munabbih, right? So Hammam ibn Munabbih was a student of Abu Huraira radiallahu ta'ala an. He has a Sahifa which was transmitted throughout the ages separately as well. It was transmitted right until the 5th, 6th century. It will be narrated separately, but it is also found absorbed in various texts. So, for example, if you look at the Musnad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, the Sahifa of Imam Munabbih is in there. You can find it, the entire thing. Likewise, if you look at Sahih al-Bukhari, in it you will find narrations from the Sahifa of Imam Nawawi. So what we're seeing is that these Sahaif then are being transmitted, but also being incorporated into various works. So when people ask, okay, you're saying that there's a Sahifa Sadiqa, where is it? I'm saying to you that if you look in the Sihah Sitta, you will find it. The isnad is Amr ibn Shu'ayb an Abihi an Jaddihi. Whenever you find a hadith in Abu Dawud, for example, with this isnad, and it's in Musnad Ahmad bin Hanbal as well, you'll see it. You realize actually this is from the Sahifa of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, like this. This leaves me with one discussion, which is oral transmission. So we're seeing that oral transmission continues all throughout these phases, right? It is as it starts off as being the norm, only then to become the exception. So the question here is, at what time does the oral transmission cease to be, right? So if there's a date we can put to it, it's around the end of the 4th century. Around the end of the 4th century, the time of Imam Bayhaqi rahimahullah. So Imam Bayhaqi rahimahullah, in one of his famous works, he mentions that if anyone was to bring us a hadith which is not written down, which is not in written form, then we won't accept it. Yeah? By the 5th century, oral transmission had ceased to be, and that whatever was in oral transmission, whatever was in circulation orally, had been committed to pen. So it's all in the books now, it's all preserved. So no one can now come and make a claim that I have a hadith which hasn't been recorded and which has continued to be transmitted to myself. Right? So this is important. This is an important distinction that needs to be made. Imam Bayhaqi goes on to say that anyone who claims so is either lying or that he's misunderstood it himself. There has to be there's some form of error in this. So here then we have this origins, as I mentioned over here. So we've got the Sahif, as we said, were official writings, papers and records, to then the encyclopedias, legal transcripts, and the lexicons. I don't know what this means, the chroniclers. And then we move on to phase 3, which was the critical reductions of the Sahih and Sunnah movements, right? The famous Sahih and Sunnah movements. These are where we find the Sihah Sitta, right? Quickly, I've just put some further reading there if you're interested on this topic of reading on the development of hadiths. There's 4 works I've put over here. This one perhaps is the latest work, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Modern World by Jonathan A.C. Brown. I know that there's a 2nd edition that's come out recently as well, so the book's done really well. I think chapter 2 and chapter 3 focus on development. Hadith literature, this one's published by One World in Oxford. You've got Hadith literature by, I think it's M.M. Siddiqui. This has been published by the Islamic Text Society. It's a slightly outdated one now, but it was an essay. So it's an essay. This is a thorough work. And this one by Shaykh Muhammad Mustafa Azmi. This is the most detailed one. It's the most thorough one, specifically on this topic, on the topic of development. He does a tremendous amount of work. Shaykh Mustafa Al-Azmi. He passed away, I think, last year. Yeah. He's a phenomenal scholar who has great achievements, great contributions to the science of hadith, especially in relation to the Orientalist work or works that are criticizing the hadith itself. And then you have, this is a small essay, I think you can read it in one sitting. It's available online. I think all of these are available online except for this one, the Jonathan A.C. Brown one. At least I'm not aware of a PDF of it. I've got some Arabic sources for those of you who read this. Do we read Arabic? We don't read Arabic, so we can move on from this. For the benefit of YouTube, okay. As-Sunnatu Qabla Tadween. This is one of its an early work. This one by Shaykh Muhammad Ajad Khatib. He is an Iraqi scholar who used to live in the UAE a long time ago, until I believe he was asked to leave. It's one of those things. If you become too famous in the UAE, the authorities want you to leave, right? So he wrote this book, As-Sunnatu Qabla Tadween. It's a very intelligent work, and it did well during its time, which basically means where was the Sunnah before it was written down in the books that we find them in now. This الدراسات في الحديث النبوي وتاريخ تدوينه is the MM Mustafa Azmi work that I referenced here. Hadith literature is studies in early hadith literature. It's this one in Arabic. And then you have a classical text here called Taqyid al-Ilm by al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who was a 5th century scholar. Right? Taqyid al-Ilm means writing things down. And you've got some Urdu references over here. Will you have any Urdu readers? Huh? You speak it? Yes. Yes, so you've got Tadween Hadith by Maulana Manazir Ahsan Gilani. This was a pioneering work. Huh? This was a pioneering work. This is a work that actually was better written. It's in Urdu, but was better written than any work in Arabic at the time. Yes, he was a professor at Osmania University in Hyderabad. Right. Then you've got Tariq Tadween Hadith by one of the Rashid Nomani. I mean, the viewers can see it. I think we'll quickly move on. Right. So here then we're moving from this general discussion of hadith literature, how it began and how it developed, to moving on to a more specific discussion, which is the 40 hadith itself. Yeah, since this book that we are studying is a book that's called 40 Hadith of Imam Nawawi. So the idea of writing 40 hadith down or writing a collection of 40 hadiths also has a long story, a long tradition, as we can see here from the board or from the slide. The names that I've put here are the ones that Imam Nawawi himself talks about. So we will see it next lesson, inshallah, when we start reading the foreword of the 40 that Imam Nawawi himself wrote. He begins by talking about why people have written 40 works and what is the objective behind it and how it came about. And so in doing so, he mentions himself that a number of scholars wrote the works on the 40, and he gives these names. Right? So we can see that one of the earliest, if not the earliest scholar to write a work on the 40 hadith is Abdullah ibn Mubarak, who is a student of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. Right? Abdullah ibn Mubarak was from Transoxiana, if I believe he was from Marv. You heard of Marv? It's currently Samarkand, Samarkand, Marv, yeah. So Marv used to be, it was the capital of the Abbasid dynasty for a couple of years after Baghdad was ransacked. The Abbasid, and due to opposition, the Khalif had to move. He relocated to Marv. Yeah, I think it's in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, in one of those countries now. So he was from Marv, right? Otherwise known as Khurasan or Transoxiana. Yeah. So 181, as you can see, from 181, which is pretty early in the grand scheme of things. If we look at, for example, the hadith, Khairul Quruni Qarni, that the best generations is my generation, then the one after it, then the one after it, like that. So he's Tabi Tabi'in or someone even after that as well. He may be a Tabi Tabi'in. I'll have to check on this. So it's still, nonetheless, it's early-ish. It's early. I don't think it's too late, but we can see how then you've got a number of scholars over here, right? They're all primarily Shafi'i, by the way. The authors over here are all primarily Shafi'i. That's because Imam Nawawi himself is a is a Shafi'i, right? And we have 676 is when he had passed away. Yeah. So we might go through some of these in a bit more detail once we start reading the Muqaddimah. So why do scholars write the 40 hadith? So Imam Nawawi himself, he references a hadith that we will look at in more detail. The hadith says, whoever preserves 40 hadith for my ummah, or from my ummah, he will be resurrected as a faqih, as a scholar on the Day of Judgment. Right? The hadith is weak. In fact, it's very weak, and it's one that is not acceptable to the scholars. Right? We will have this discussion, inshallah. Again, we will have this discussion as well regarding the weak hadiths. But Imam Nawawi himself, being someone who is willing to accommodate weak hadiths and practice upon them if they're of a certain quality, considers this to be lackluster, right? So he considers this weak hadith to be so weak that it isn't really practicable. Nonetheless, he said that it's something that scholars have done, so he's citing precedents, something scholars have done, and therefore it's something that I'm going to go ahead and do. He also mentions people's motives behind it, right? So he said that, for example, Ibn Mubarak rahimahullah, when he wrote the 40 hadiths, his collection of 40 hadiths was on jihad, the 40 hadiths of jihad. And perhaps that's because Imam Ibn Mubarak was an interesting scholar. And actually, this is worth mentioning. He's a unique figure in the sense that he's widely accepted by different groups. Right? The more distant we become from the Prophet ﷺ's time, we start to see that people start to fragment, scholarship starts to fragment, right, with the passage of time, and that people start having different inclinations and partisanship and X, Y, and Z. What we see is that there are individuals who are able to transcend this, or at least the ummah then widely accepts the person. So he's one of them, and I think one of the reasons why that is because he divided his life, or his year. Every year he said he divided into 4. So he spent 4 months doing jihad, 4 months doing business, 4 months with the Sufis, and 4 months with the fuqaha, and 4 months with the muhaddithin. So like that, he's able to work with everyone. He's able to work with everyone, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why he's widely praised by everyone. Right? Abdullah Mubarak. Yeah. And Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, as we'll speak about him in a moment as well, he's amongst them. So what makes the Nawawi 40 so unique? This is the question. Or maybe let's step back a moment and ask ourselves, do we have a rough figure of how many 40 hadith compilations have been written in the history of Islam? Do you have a rough guess? How many 40s have been written? So 40 is basically a scholar sitting down and collecting 40 hadiths on a given topic. It could be anything on a given topic. You have a rough guess, rough estimate? Huh? 10, 20, more? 100? It's a good start. It's a good start. If statistics are anything to go by, there's a work that was published in 1995. So even my knowledge is a bit dated on this. But there was an index. It's called Dalilul Mu'allafatil Hadith Sharif. This is an index of works on hadith that have been published since the printing press, which came about the 18th century, up to 1995. And they've mentioned around 116. Yeah, so it's not too far. But these are ones that have been published, right? Not the ones that, and from 1995 till today, so we're looking at around what, the 20, 30 years, there's been a lot more. Yeah, a significant amount, just as many, if not more. So we're looking at around 200, 300. But there's more. There's definitely more. There's definitely more. What also seems to be the case is, once, as I keep saying, that scholars write works. Posterity, then the scholars that come after, want to refine the work, right? Want to make it better. They contribute to the 40, So as we saw, Ibn Mubarak wrote a book called what, 40 on jihad, right? Tusi, I believe he has a 40 on Sufism, right? Imam Ajurri has it on the 40 of the Quran, 40 of the Quran and so on. We'll look at this inshallah in more detail. The refinement, scholars start to innovate in the 40 itself. So again, this is all to do with patterns that emerge. So when it's not low, there's a saying, خبزه حتى احترق, خبزه حتى احترق, that somebody put the bread in the oven for so long that it burnt. Meaning that can you overcompensate the reduction? Can you overcompensate something to the extent that it becomes pointless or there's little value to it? So an example of this would be, not sure if you're aware of the history of the subcontinent, but there's a particular king by the name of Akbar of the Mughal dynasty, and he has, a long story short, he has a courtesan, a scholar who isn't a Sunni, and he's largely responsible for misleading him. But just to show the genius that he is, he wrote a tafsir which is called Sawati'ul Ilham. Right? So even if you notice the letters that are being used, Sawati'ul Ilham, it's otherwise known as Tafsir bi Nuqat. So he wrote an entire tafsir ensuring that he doesn't use a letter that has a dot in it. It's like Ba has a dot underneath it, right? Ta has 2 dots on top, and Tha has 3 dots. Jim has a dot, it's a belly letter, and Kha. So he wrote an entire tafsir making sure that he doesn't use a letter that has a dot on it. That has a dot throughout the whole tafsir. But okay, that's fine, but the question is it any good as a tafsir if we're saying tafsir means to explain the words of the Quran? No, because essentially he's using words that are not necessarily known, but just to make sure that he's using a word that doesn't have dots, he's going to use, so you're going to end up having to pick up a dictionary to try and work out what he's saying anyway. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say is that a time comes where I think scholars themselves felt that we can't add any more to it. So what are some of the books that were written then in this innovative period, in this period of refinement? So we can start off with Ibn Asakir. Ibn Asakir wrote a book called Hadith al-Buldaniya. 40 hadiths via 40 shuyukh in 40 different cities, going back to 40 different companions, like this, right? And you end up with someone like Al-Ghafiqi, who wrote 40 hadiths from 40 shuyukh, from 40 different tribes, going back to 40 different books, going back to 40 different companions, saying 40 different things, like this, right? So they outdid the whole 40, if that makes sense. And then it's the thing like, is there a real point behind this, right? And then there's another work called Arba'un al-Bakriya, that's what it's known as, right? So here's a scholar from Makkah who was asked to write 40 hadiths. He's like, people have written 40 hadiths. So now I'm going to do is, I'm going to give you 40 hadiths via 40 different shuyukh who've written works on the 40 themselves, right? And it's innovating to this degree. And hence I'm saying that you get to a point where you think, okay, where are we going with this? Like, 40, every possible scenario you can create from the 40, we've created it and we're done. So in this sense, I'm saying that, is there a huge value behind it? Maybe not. But just for the sake of, if you like, innovation, for the sake of seeing the obsession of the 40 through, I think they did what they had to do. Are there any 40s? Are you aware of any 40s other than the 40 in Nawawi? Aware of any of the 40 books? Any scholars wrote 40? Right? There's a number of them. We will go through them. The Turath Publishing, if you're aware of it, Turath Publishing from London, right? It's a publishing house. They have a series called the 40 series. So they started a series when I think just as they started, they've got a series called the 40 series where they published a number of 40 hadiths. So they've got, for example, they've got the Imam Nawawi one, which they've published obviously, but you're looking at 40 of Ibn Asakir on Ummahatul Mu'mineen. Yeah, you've got 40 of Mullah Ali Qari on Fada'il al-Quran. Right? You've got 40 of Mullah Jami, which is just on adab, on akhlaq, like this. So you've got 40, 40, 40, 40 like this. From the 40s that I'm interested in and which haven't been published yet. You may have heard of a king again from India called Aurangzeb. If you heard of him, Aurangzeb Alamgir. He's a rather controversial figure in the history of India. So Aurangzeb Rahmatullahi wrote two 40s, both of them on governance, one before he became an emperor and one after he became an emperor. And one of my teachers at the Nadwa, he had one of them. It was in gold ink, embossed in gold. So that's a 40 that I'd be interested in working in, right? And just it's on governance, right? It's 40 hadiths on governance. Yeah, so there's a number of them, and there are 40 hadiths even till today. People writing 40 hadiths even today. But what we can say is, from the entire 40 genre, if there's 140 that has been studied, there's 140 that scholars have accepted, scholars have read it, they've memorized it, they've taught it, it's this one, 40 Imam Nawawi. And you'll understand why it's so important. Why is there such a emphasis on 40? To the extent that many people don't even know that another 40 exists. You know, there's people out there, if you ask them 40 hadith, the first book that goes to their mind is the one by Imam Nawawi. And we will look at Imam Nawawi, inshallah, next lesson we'll look at Imam Nawawi in more detail. But of his karamat, of the karamat, and there's so many karamat, that I actually wrote a small treatise on this, right? From my own readings of the Salaf, of the scholars of the past. After Imam Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, right, if there is a scholar to whose name we found so many karamat coming from good sources, it's Imam Nawawi rahimahullah. So of the karamat that we find is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted his works. Yeah, there's one karama, they say that a nur came out of his grave and transcended onto his books. Yeah. And if you want to see a modern manifestation of this karama, it's the fact that I think around 2 years ago, a French magazine, I think it's called Jeune Afrique, is the name of the. I have the article, right? If you're interested in it, they published the best-selling works in French, bestsellers in French, and the third bestseller in French for I think the past decade was the 40 of Imam Nawawi rahimahullah. Yeah? Who would have thought? You know, at the time Imam Nawawi rahimahullah was writing this, he finished the last edition of the 40, I think around 3 years or 4 years before he passed away. Do you think he'd have an idea that you know, this book was going to be read in Paris, yeah, amongst the Francophile, that students of knowledge will be walking around with the 40 in the périphérique of Paris? No, he wouldn't. In the salons where Voltaire once used to discuss the revolution, no. But this is a fact. This is the truth. No, I'm saying of the past. I'll give you lots of examples of the past of how widely accepted Imam Nawawi rahimahullah's works were of the past. But I'm saying this karama is still continuing. It's still continuing. It just requires one to to investigate, and there you have it. Yeah? So what's so unique about this 40? Well, perhaps it's in the name. Perhaps it's in the name. So Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he mentions the 40 via this name in a number of his works. So the question here is, does the 40 is arba'un, right? So nowadays when you go and buy the book, it's 40 Imam Nawawi, arba'un Nawawiyya, arba'in Nawawiyya. But Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he referred to the 40 in a number of his works via this title here, right? And I think Some people have said that this isn't a title, it's a description that he's given it. Whatever the case is, I think this is it's more scientific, and it's more clear than just saying 40 hadith, right? What is it? He says, Al-Arba'in fi mabani al-Islam. Mabna is the foundation of Islam. So you've got 40 hadiths on the foundations of Islam, things that are necessary for you to know if you're a Muslim, right? In another of his works, the Majmu', he mentions that these 40 لا يستغني عنها متدين, that they are indispensable for anyone who is following Islam and who is practicing and who has the akhirah as his goal, right? So you can see that 40 hadiths, when we read them, you realize that the 40 hadiths that very much summarize Islam. They summarize Islam, reducing the entire Islam into 40 hadiths. Number one. And number two, he says, وَقَوَاعِدِ الْأَحْكَامِ. Fiqh. The fiqh is many. There's so many chapters of fiqh. But what he's looking at he's looking for hadiths that apply to every chapter of fiqh. That are the core essentials of fiqh. Fiqh is founded on these things. So if you know these, then you realize that the vast majority of fiqh is fleshed out from these rulings. Fleshes out from these rulings. Simple example of this that you will have heard so many times: alcohol is haram. Yeah, the Quran uses the word khamar. Khamar is the word that's used. And if you're going to be strictly Hanafi, you'll know that khamar is intoxicant beverages that are made from 5 grains and no more. 5 grains and no more. The one that everyone agrees on is wine. Wine, grape. Right, so intoxication beverage pressed from wine or fermented from grapes is wine. Right, this bil ijma', consensus of all the scholars, is intoxicating. It's intoxicating and it's haram. It's haram, no doubt. No one disagrees on this. The question is, now that you know this, can you apply it to all the other beverages that are intoxicating? The answer is yes. Like this. So once you've got this rule, what's the rule? You know that this is the rule. What's the rule? The rule is beverages that intoxicate are not permissible. This is what we deducted from the hadith itself or from the verse which talks about khamar being haram. You can deduct it. Like this, what we're saying is there are certain rules that are mentioned in these hadiths, wonderful hadiths, that are brief yet very, very comprehensive. Very, very comprehensive. So the 40 then, as we're saying, its objective is, I would argue, is more important than the vast majority of works that have been written in the 40. Yeah, this is a very important objective, and it's a noble one. Hence, it's been widely studied. 40. You'll see post Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, huge scholars, the likes of Ibn Hajar Asqalani rahimahullah, right? Amirul Mu'minina fil Hadith, among the latest scholars. He began his studies by memorizing the 40. Even till today, if there's anyone of note that you know from the traditional side, Syria, Egypt, you begin by memorizing the 40, by reflecting on the 40. So in that sense, you can see why it's an important text. Yeah. So here we'll go through it again. Arba'in, 40 hadiths. Fi is in Mabani al-Islam, on the foundations of Islam. Wa qawa'id al-ahkam. Qa'ida is a rule. The rule, qa'ida. And ahkam, hukm, means a ruling. Yeah, Allah says, do this, don't do this. The Prophet says, do this, don't do this. So divine rulings. Yeah, it's come from a divine source. This is what we're saying. So all the rulings of do, don't do, you should, you ought not to, all of this, he's saying we can try and summarize this in some basic rulings. Some basic rulings. And that's what he's trying to do. Hopefully this is making sense, or is it not making sense? Yeah. Do you want me to give another example, or is that okay? Alhamdulillah. Excellent. So here, look, Imam Nawawi rahimahullah says, look, indispensable for every practicing Muslim, as it is all authentic. All of it is authentic. We'll look at these claims in more detail as we go through the book. Like, what is he saying? He says, comprising the foundations of Islam. Both its roots, the roots of Islam. So what is Islam? We look at Hadith Jibreel, for example. Hadith Jibreel is what? Islam is the 5 pillars. The 5 pillars of Islam that we know of. What are the 5 pillars? Do you know the 5 pillars of Islam? Of Tawheed, of the Shahada, then Salatan, Sawman, Zakat, and Hajj. These are the 5 pillars. He'll mention them. As well as what? The branches, the roots and the branches. Sorry, what are the roots of Islam? The roots of Islam actually is the Iman. Belief. Right? So the belief of, again, if you take the Hadith Jibreel, it's, I'm not sure if you use these words, we call it Iman Mufassal. At least when I was in Maktab. Iman Mufassal, Amantu Billahi wa Malaikatihi wa Kutubihi wa Rasulihi. Do you remember this? No, you don't remember it. Amantu Billahi wa Malaikatihi wa Kutubihi wa Rasulihi wal Yawmil Akhiri wal Qadri Khayrihi wa Sharrihi min Allah Ta'ala wal Ba'thi Ba'da al Maut. This is called Iman Mufassal. At least in the Maktab we went to, it's called Iman Mufassal. So it's belief in Allah, the angels, messengers, books, belief in life after death, belief in the hereafter, belief in fate, the good and the bad of it. This is what's considered Iman as per the Hadith Jibreel. So these are the roots. If you believe in Allah, if you believe in angels, if you believe in what prophets. Angels are important because it's through the angels that we get, that the prophets get wahi. The communication from the other side to this side is done by the medium of angels, and this is why angels are important and why angels come before messengers. So believe in Allah, messengers, and then what? Sorry, believe in Allah, angels, the messengers, then books. In this order, that's why it's come in this order. So if you believe in this, then you can be asked to believe in what? Prayer, fasting, and so on. So these are the, we can call them the articulations, the outer, if you like, the outer. Because do we see the roots of a tree? Can you see the roots of a tree? What we see are the branches and the fruits, like this. So Iman is something that's in the heart, not necessarily visible, but the manifestation of it is visible. Yeah, so if someone is praying, we can see them praying. Somebody's going to the mosque, X, Y, and Z. Someone's going to Hajj, like this, so we see it. So this is what he means by its roots and branches. Usul and furu', we call this usul and furu'. As well as the axioms of asceticism. Do you know what axioms are? These are generic rules, broad strokes of zuhud, of asceticism. And we look at these and etiquettes and good behavior. Yeah? Right. We'll look at this, I think, next lesson. But okay, I'll just quickly mention this and we'll look at it again. The 40 that Imam Nawawi has written, the 40 I have over here, it didn't come overnight. What happened is that he inherited a work by one of his predecessors, a scholar before him called Ibn Salah. Very important figure, very important muhaddith, very important hadith scholar who settled in Syria. He lived in Syria, and he taught at a very famous madrasa known as the Madrasa al-Ashrafiyya, or Darul Hadith al-Ashrafiyya. This is what it was called, Darul Hadith al-Ashrafiyya. It's one of the most prestigious seats of learning, and especially of hadith, in the entire Islamic during that time. And Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he then rose to this seat as well. Near the end of his life, he rose to this position too. So he had inherited a majlis. Majlis is a sitting of Ibn Salah. In the olden days, they used to have these gatherings known as Imla. Imla was when a Shaykh would sit down and he would dictate. He would dictate in a nice, clear voice, and the students would write down the dictation. Yeah, this is called Majlis Imla. So Ibn Salah had a Majlis Imla. He had an auditioning, if you like, in a gathering where he collected 26 hadiths, and he called them al-ahadith al-kulliyya. Kulli means a maxim. It means a comprehensive hadith, if you like, right? So he collected a bunch of hadiths, 26 in total, where he tried to look at hadiths that were comprehensive and that were summarizing vast amounts of Islam, huge amounts of Islam, like this. So Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, in the Bustan al-Arifin, he cites them as 26. He cites them. Bustan al-Arifin is an interesting work. Imam Nawawi did not complete it. That's why I've got an NA over here. He passed away before he finished it. but it's very much a summary of Imam Qushayri rahimahullah's work on tasawwuf. I forget the name of the book now, Imam Qushayri. But it's Bustanul Arifin means the garden of the Gnostics, right? So he's talking about what do Sufis do, what do they believe in, like that. So Qushayri has a book, so I remember the name. Their name is Risala Qushayriya. Risala Qushayri is an important book by a Shafi'i scholar, Imam al-Qushayri, Abu al-Qasim, Ibn Hawazin, where it's written to talk about what Sufis actually believe in and what they don't believe in at a time when there's lots of confusion. Yeah, perhaps like now, people don't know what Sufis do, or if you're relying too much on the YouTube, then you're going to be misled, all right? Or maybe we'll say that that type of tasawwuf is not Sunni tasawwuf, it's not one that we recognize. So Imam Qushayri rahimahullah wrote this very important book of what is it that Sufis believe in. And he's citing the elders, he's citing Junaid and Shibli and so on. So Imam Nawawi rahimahullah was using this work and preparing notes and dictating them. So Bustan al-Arifin is, but it's an incomplete work. But in there he mentions the Hadith Kulliya. Thereafter in Kitab al-Adhkar. Kitab al-Adhkar is a very famous work. It's one of the important works. Again, if we look back at the trajectory that I mentioned, you have chroniclers and then you have critics. So this work is a critical work in which Imam Nawawi rahimahullah has appropriated the encyclopedias before him. The works of Ibn Sunni, Imam al-Nasa'i, al-Tabarani, who wrote Kitabu al-Da'awat and Amalul Yawmi wal-Layla. Huge texts, thick volumes. But again, they contain the good, the bad and the ugly. So Imam Nawawi rahimahullah said, I'm going to condense, take all the good things out of it, isolate it and prepare one volume. And it's a very important work. You know, in Syria, they have a saying that, in Syria they say that you can't find a single house in which there isn't a copy of Kitab al-Adhkar. And if there isn't, then they say, بِعِ الدَّارِ وَاشْتَرِ الْأَذْكَارِ. This is a saying, بِعِ الدَّارِ وَاشْتَرِ الْأَذْكَارِ, which means sell your house and buy a copy of Adhkar. Is that important? It's a saying that they have. So near the end of Kitab al-Adhkar, near the end, Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, then he adds to the 26 and he presents 30. He's saying these are important. So at the end of the work, he gives ijazah to all the Muslims who reads his book. He says, I give ijazah out of tabarruk to every Muslim who reads my book. They have the hadith ijazah from me. At the same time, he says, I'm going to share some very important hadith with you. Every Muslim should know these. So he's emphasizing these hadiths again. But we can see that he's added how many? He's added 4 hadiths. He's added 4 hadiths to Ibn Salah. Right. Thereafter, Imam Nawawi rahimahullah then wrote the 40 hadiths. Okay, this one that we have. And how many hadiths does he have in it? 42. What's going on over here? He's saying 40 hadiths. Is he lying? He's not lying. No. The Arabs have this way of rounding off numbers. The Arabs have a way of rounding off numbers. Right? They have a saying, لِلْأَكْثَرِ حُكْمُ الْكُلْ وَالشَّاذ كَالْمَعْدُومِ. Right? The majority takes the position of the entirety. And what that means is, look, if we have 5, right? What's half of 5? 2.5, right? Look at your hand right now. We have a hand. 3. Can you see 3? 3 is majority. 3 is majority. So 3 will take the position of 5, like this. If you have 2, 2 is 0, like this. So this is how they work. Yeah. So 42, if you look at 42, 42 is closer to 40 or to 45? 40, hence it's 40. That's not 42, right? And then you have a scholar called Ibn Rajab Hanbali, who wrote, I believe, we can argue it's the most important, one of the most important commentaries and the most exhaustive commentaries as well. It's a huge, thick volume on Imam Nawawi. He wrote a book called Jami' al-Ulum wal-Hikam. This was amongst the first works that Turath Publishing published. It's called, I think, the Compendium of Sciences. It's translated by Abdul Samad Clark. Right? This one. So Ibn Rajab rahimahullah came and he added another 8 hadiths, making it 50. So he then, continuing the methodology that Imam Nawawi rahimahullah said, that look, I'm going to add hadiths that are indispensable for each individual, that will condense huge amounts, vast amounts of Islam and fiqh. He says, okay, keeping this in mind, actually there's a couple that Imam Nawawi should have added, that I think he should have added, these ones here, and that makes the 50. Okay, and then with this we will inshallah wrap up our majlis. We'll look at this again because Ibn Salah rahimahullah took also not the 26, but he took a number of hadiths from a scholar before him called Qadi Shihab. Qadi Shihab, I believe, he wrote a small pamphlet with about 3, 4, 5, 6 hadiths, saying that these represent a huge amount of Islam. Right? A huge amount of Islam come through this, and so on and so on. So one of the things that we'll be doing then in our commentary is looking at what are these axioms, what makes this hadith so fundamental to Islam. And that's, I think, what I really want to reinforce, apart from all the discussions that will come through. I think these are the things that we'll highlight, inshallah. Okay. If you have any questions, you may ask, otherwise we'll wrap up here, inshallah. Any questions? Okay, we'll stop here then. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdik.